Comparatively to the other countries that have been dominating the artistic scene for centuries, America is a very young country that is still artistically developing. But despite this, America has still managed to establish itself as a strong force in innovating the nature of visual arts internationally. But most notably is the internal impact of visual arts on the United States. The origin of arts from the United States starts very humbly, as the first use of the arts in the new country was almost entirely realism, or the literal artistic interpretation of real-life objects. This was mostly just for research purposes of the New World's amazing landscapes and birds and whatnot. Even through the colonization of the Revolutionary War, art was still used more as a service than as an expression. Although art was evolving with the arrival of immigrant John Smyber, who brought with him a surging popularity for portraits, the US was far from having a distinguished cultural identity. But with the turn of the 18th century, a craving for this individualization began to rise. The US's way of doing that was by creating a number of historical paintings that would portray events of American history in thematic ways. With the 19th century, Americans finally started to utilize the opportunities that the mysteries of the New World had on the art world. Thomas Cole introduced a movement called the Hudson River School, which depicted ambitious and stunning natural landscapes based off of what artists were dreaming the then unexplored West would be like. This movement caught the attention of many artists across the country as they all portrayed their own unique versions of the West. But art wasn't only pushing boundaries within the art world. During the Civil War, many artists would take bold steps in creating pieces relating to the topic of slavery. But the most impactful piece of the era is possibly Negro Life in the South by Eastman Johnson.
And that painting is incredible because Eastman Johnson had been studying abroad in Europe for a number of years. He comes back to the United States in 1855, and obviously, the 1850s in the United States, right? Everybody's totally divided around the issue of slavery. It's a painting of a backlot that can be interpreted either as an abolitionist tract, a really anti-slavery piece, or a completely pro-slavery piece, like a completely perfect pastoral of plantation life. And so in that way, Eastman Johnson really creates a painting that contemporary Americans, I think, were able to use to work out their own feelings about politics.
As the century continues, art began to take a more experimental turn. This was very much inspired by French Expressionism, and the most notable artists of the late 19th century like Mary Cassatt, James McNeill Whistler, and John Singer Sargent had reportedly spent a lot of time in Europe. So America was still somewhat struggling to form a distinct and long-lasting identity for its visual arts culture. Almost immediately as the 20th century came around, a movement known as American Realism came around. This movement was spearheaded by Robert Henry, who is quoted as saying, "To heck with artistic values." This phrase really embodied the movement, as artists focused less on royalty and jaw-dropping landscapes and focused more on portraying the everyman in his natural habitat. This movement also brought to life the artistic potential within photography, as photographer Alfred Stieglitz ignited the photosecession, as he called it. This newly found appreciation was benefited with the creation of pictorialism, in which an artist would take a picture and basically warp it a bunch to give it a more unique aesthetic. As a symbol of the modernist movement, Stieglitz opened the 291 Gallery in New York, displaying a number of significant, ambitious modernist pieces from a wider range of mediums. But after World War I, a sudden rejection of modernist art began to erupt as a newfound influence in the School of Paris began to rise. Around the same time, the creation of the Santa Fe Railroad brought with it sprawling artistic communities along the West. The unique landscapes and environments of the West inspired artists like Georgia O'Keeffe and Walter Ufer, and their pieces would go on to inspire many Eastern citizens to move out west, as much of the art was used as advertisement for Western settlements. A movement with a lot of political relevance was the Harlem Renaissance. In this movement, black people combated the prominent racism and cruel representation of black people by white people in media. This movement helped to spread a pride in black people, and showed African Americans as respectable and capable people, as rightfully so. Once Roosevelt came along with his New Deal in an attempt to fix the Great Depression, he sponsored the Public Works of Art project, which gave many artists jobs in painting public artworks for the decoration of cities. This resulted in almost 15,000 paintings created in total, which has brought with it a fair share of new movements, and there was a growing interest in more abstract art. Thus started one of the most important movements in American history, abstract expressionism. These pieces focused on the expression of raw emotions in the form of indistinguishable shapes and paint splatters. This was achieved with a new technique called action painting, which involved the artist focusing mostly on creative process by applying paint in unconventional and typically aggressive ways. Although controversial, abstract expressionism saw the first time in history when the international spotlight for art had shifted away from Europe and onto America. Abstract expressionism led to many genres like pop art, hard edge paintings, fluxes, post-minimalism, yada yada yada, but most importantly, it evolved art into much more advanced directions, toying with exciting and creative ways to provoke emotions. And this is a movement that wouldn't be possible without America. Whether directly or indirectly, art has done a lot to shape the formation of America as a country. America has managed to culminate a distinct identity within 239 years of existence, and a strong one at that, and it probably wouldn't be the same if it weren't for the spectrum of artists that helped mold it along the way.